My name is Noman Naqvi. I am presently working at the Habib University Foundation, where we are setting up Habib University. And I'm a prospective faculty member, essentially, there. And it is indeed a great pleasure. I mean, this is customary to say, but I've known Siddharth for a very long time. I will say very proudly. So this is not just formality. It is really a great pleasure and an honor, really, to introduce to you Siddhartha Deb. I mean, I could go on and we'd just spend most of the time just counting off his many, many achievements at such a young age. So I will just start by reading out what his newest book, which we are here to discuss, The Beautiful and the Damned, a portrait of the new India, says. It says, Siddhartha Deb teaches creative writing at the New School in New York City and is the author of 2 novels, very, very fine novels. The Point of Return, which was a 2003 New York Times Notable Book of the Year and an outline of the Republic. His reviews in journalism have appeared in the Boston Globe, The Guardian, Harper's Magazine, The Nation, The New Statesman, N+1, and the Times Literary Supplement. Now that's as simple as it could possibly be. But Siddhartha is really one of the most serious writers in the subcontinent today. I mean, I think one of the somewhat baleful legacies of Salman Rushdie on South Asian literature has been that there is a great deal of frivolity that characterizes South Asian writing in English. Siddhartha is as far from that as is possible. He is an extraordinarily serious writer, right? He pays full attention to the very, very serious catastrophe that is our condition in South Asia, which is really an open secret, although we try to pretend otherwise all the time to ourselves. Siddhartha will insist on us having us acknowledge these open secrets at great, indeed morbid length. I mean, and the new book, non-fiction, I mean, we hear all these insane celebrations of our world going on everywhere. Humanity has not ever had it so good, right, as in this world of globalization. Well, Siddhartha shows us the infernal underbelly of this world. I mean, I think he wouldn't probably agree with this word infernal. He's become tempered with age. But because the sense you get in the book, it's like a slow hell, right? That is the world we live in. I mean, the book itself is about India, as the cover says, but really, it's, as the best writing does, it shows us the truth of our condition at a much, much larger level. It's not just about India. Of course, what has happened in India in the past 20, 25 years is truly extraordinary, one of the great world historical transformations in the history of humanity. Now, Siddhartha is here to capture for us this moment of extreme danger, right? And for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of reading the book, let me just name the chapters for you, because the book is structured really beautifully, right? So the first chapter, The Great Gatsby, a rich man in India. So we start at the top, or somewhere towards the top of India Shining, right? With the portrayal of a very ambitious young man, right? The Great Gatsby, a rich man in India. The second chapter, Ghost in the Machine, the engineer's burden. We are still hovering at the top, right? Then Red Sorghum, farmers in the free market. Then the factory, the permanent world of temporary workers. So the way he structured it is essentially, first you get a look at, from the very top, he shows you these cracks in this India Shining, which we all see, right? in Bollywood, on television, etc. The cracks there. It's very, very subtle writing. Right? The cracks, and then you fall through the cracks to the bottom and see. Right? But within that, you also see what the lives of people at the top are like. So The Great Gatsby, the first chapter, is unfortunately not a part of the Indian edition. It is a part of the editions that have been published in England and in America, but not a part of the Indian edition, because the subject of the chapter, this gentleman Arindam Chaudhary, has filed a suit against Siddhartha, and I'll let Siddhartha tell you a little bit about the suit.
Sure. Thank you, Noman, for that incredibly generous introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's my first time in Karachi, in Pakistan. It is a journey that I was absolutely delighted to make. I'm turning around and going back tonight, but I thought it was more than well worth it to travel for 30 hours. And one of the great pleasures was that, to be with, to have this conversation with Noman, who's really somebody who's known me before I even wrote the first novel. And in fact, he's read that first novel in manuscript form as it was happening. So we go a long way back, and there was a time when we were both fixtures outside the Butler Library at Columbia University, and a source of great amusement to many of our American colleagues, because they always saw us standing around smoking and talking and never apparently attending any classes, in this sort of good subcontinental tradition. So yeah, it's a delight to be here and to talk about this book, which is a kind of look at contemporary India and India Shining. And the first chapter was basically a kind of study of the new rich, the wealth that, is very much projected all the time in the Indian media, certainly, but also the Western media in this sort of this great celebration. The idea that India is this sort of has woken up from its long Gandhian fast and has finally joined the world party. And of course, I decided to take a close look at it. The chapter was excerpted in an American publication and then in an Indian magazine called Caravan magazine, and then at which point, before the book had come out in India, at which point of time Mr. Chaudhary is a great entrepreneur, he's a great entrepreneur, he's a management guru, he owns a chain of management institutes which are wildly successful. If you have been to Delhi or Bombay or Hyderabad or Bangalore, you have certainly seen his face staring at you from the pages of any major newspaper or magazine in the country. But Mr. Chaudhary was offended by this portrait that was, which to my mind is actually quite a nuanced portrait, but his company certainly had a difference of opinion. And so an injunction was taken out, not in Delhi, where the publisher is based and where the magazine itself is based and where Mr. Chaudhary's company is based, but about 2,000 kilometers away in a very small town near the Bangladesh border called Silchar. And it happens to be a great irony because it's a town actually where my parents owned a house, and Mr. Chaudhary has never lived there, but I have, which is, so it was taken out from this little court, and the law being what it is in India, once the injunction had been taken out, without really giving us a chance to respond, which technically the law is supposed to allow you to do, but we never had a chance to respond to why the injunction shouldn't be taken out. The injunction was taken out, at which point it became a kind of illegal to publish the chapter in India in any form. And the suit was for, I believe, something like $50 million. The people named in the suit, the entities named in the lawsuit are Caravan magazine, which published the excerpt, Penguin India, which was going to publish the book, me, and Google India, because I think Mr. Chaudhary is very upset by the fact that for some reason, whenever you type his name into Google India, one of the first autofill suggestions that comes up is fraud. So Google is also a part of the lawsuit, which delights me. Since Google has much more money than I do, it delights me that Google should be a part of the lawsuit. But yes, the book in India, we are both carrying the American editions for the reasons of convenience. But basically, the book in India does not have the first chapter, and instead it has a little red band, a little belt around it, which says the first chapter has been removed in accordance with the court order. And there the matter stands, and we'll wait for that to be resolved in the courts. Right. And of course, illegally people pass around the chapter on the internet all the time.
Well, quite apart from the issues of freedom of expression, which are usually brought up in such a context, really this injunction does a very specific violence to this very finely crafted book. Because the form, because Siddhartha is after all a writer's writer, right? It is the form of the book that is truly remarkable and that opens up another world for you, which is what a writer tries to do. But in this case, it happens to be our world. You're opening up another world that is our world. But, so I'll try to give you a flavor of this by reading the first paragraph, because I think it's quite dense. I mean, one of the things that struck me about the book is how much resonance there is. All kinds of things resonate across the chapters, and it's that sense of resonance across the chapters that opens up this other world for you, right? So The Great Gatsby, a rich man in India, this is how it opens. This is the first paragraph. A phenomenally wealthy Indian who excites hostility and suspicion is an unusual creature, a fish that has managed to muddy the waters it swims in. There's implication, the implication here, of course, is clear, that in fact, this is, given the culture of success that is characteristic of the new India for Siddhartha, but is of course characteristic of the world of globalization in general. Obsessed we are with success and ambition. So a phenomenally wealthy Indian who excites hostility and suspicion is an unusual creature, a fish that has managed to muddy the waters it swims in. The glow of admiration lighting up the rich and the successful disperses before it reaches him, hinting that things have gone wrong somewhere. It suggests that beneath the sleek coating of luxury, deep under the sheen of power, there is a failure, barely sensed by the man who owns that failure, along with his expensive accoutrements. This was Arindam Chaudhary's situation when I first met him in 2007. He had achieved great wealth and prominence, partly by projecting an image of himself as wealthy and prominent. This is one of the remarkable facts of this world of globalization, that you can achieve wealth and prominence by projecting an image of yourself as wealthy and prominent. So in the first paragraph, he's captured a remarkable truth about our world today. He had achieved great wealth and prominence, partly by projecting an image of himself as wealthy and prominent. Yet somewhere along the way, he had also created the opposite effect, which, in spite of his best efforts, had given him a reputation as a fraud, scamster, and Johnny-come-lately. We'll come to the question of frauds and scams later. This is the next paragraph. The first sentence only I'll read from the next paragraph. We'll come to the question of frauds and scams later, but it is indisputable that Arindam had arrived very quickly. Right? Now, frauds and scams there are throughout the book. I mean, in fact, what he's essentially, Siddhartha is showing us that fraud and scam, unlike the discourse we have about corruption, frauds and scam, well, that's us. It is not something apart from us. Right? This is the world which we inhabit. So one of the themes that ties together this book is precisely this sense. And this is the first question I wanted to ask you, for you to elaborate on, is this remarkable sense that you give us, right, of the lies and new kinds of lies, all kinds of new kinds of lies in which we live that are very much part of who we are.
Well, I mean, absolutely. I mean, in a way, I suppose, when I set out to write this book, it was based on this idea that the new India, or India shining, as the slogan coined by the BJP in 2004 had, it was a lie. But I was interested in uncovering the complexities of that lie. And you know, although I was very critical, deeply critical of this sort of India shining image of the realities that it, or of these certain things that it tried to project, I also decided that, you know, I was basically going into a project of what people might call immersion journalism, which involved really spending a lot of time with various sorts of people in India, including the rich, whom I don't really know very well, actually, because I'm an outsider to that in India. And I was looking for somebody who was rich, and I was looking for somebody who was interesting at the same time, beyond just the accoutrements that they had. Because one of the things that happened is when I went around Delhi, I needed access to the world of the rich. I went around asking people, so tell me about an interesting rich person. And they would name names, and I'd say, what is it that makes him interesting? And it was usually a he. They would say, well, they have a lot of money, and they would name the amounts of the wealth, the companies. And that's fine, but what is it? What else makes it interesting? And that would stop people. They would say, well, he flies private planes. He has a private vineyard. Horses, race horses, which you can only go so far with. I wasn't interested in writing a kind of business magazine profile. But with Arindam, what happened was they said, well, he's controversial, which immediately intrigued my journalist sensibility. I was also a journalist for some years. And I guess basically what happened was I'd never heard of the man until then. And that probably shows you how badly I was following the new India. Because, it's a country that I've grown up in. And I've been living for 13 years in New York. But until I went to New York and met Noman, I had grown up completely in various parts of India. But once somebody mentioned Arindam Chaudhary's name, I really began to see him everywhere. I would see him in the newspapers every day. What other newspapers were showing up at the friend's house I was staying in, the magazines. And I think it made these claims, and largely the claims were about the Management Institute. He has a chain of them in Calcutta. No, he doesn't have one in Calcutta, actually, sorry. He has one in Delhi, in Bombay, in Hyderabad. And then there were all these claims that there are, he's opening one in Dubai, he's opening one in London, he's opening one in America, he's opening one in Singapore. And so it's this sort of endless sort of expansion, which in itself was a very nice metaphorical illustration of this new India, that, we are growing, we are expanding, we are big, we are rich, we are everywhere. But a lot of claims. And, whenever you asked for some, verifying aspects, often that was problematic. So that's how I sort of slipped into this world, and I spent a lot of time with Mr. Chaudhary and his many associates and colleagues, and, traveled around. I, attended his seminars, and I went to his his institute. And this thing of performance came up often. I felt, he's a very interesting person to look at, for instance. He's quite young. He's a couple of years younger than me. And, he wears these designer suits, and he has a ponytail, which, raises there are a lot of jokes about that on the internet. And he wears designer sunglasses. There's an impression of flamboyance, of energy. And, he's a management guru. He has all these theories about India, about the world, about India's place in the world. And that's what I tried to get into in the book, and, examine it from different sides. But, I was trying to create a kind of portrait of this character. And obviously my interest in him was also that he represented something about the new wealth, about the new elite in India.
No, I mean, throughout the book, I'm actually struck by, this is one of the ways in which the different chapters and the different characters function, is that even though Siddharth gives complete attention to that one character, but that character then emerges as a kind of paradigm, right? Functions as a kind of paradigm. You would otherwise say a symbol, but I think paradigm is better because it has that sense of something that is quite of the moment, right? And Arindam functions like that as well. I mean, it's a kind of bizarre thing you pull, basically, because on the one hand, it's very specific, and it's all detail. This book is very, very short on generalizations. You would think that usually people from the left, this is often what people say, well, they're constantly lost in abstraction. Well, this book is certainly not lost in abstractions. It's as concrete as it can get. But it is, and this is the remarkable thing about what writing can do. It's through the particulars that something like a paradigm emerges, right?
Well, I mean, it's basically, that reminds me of, this American writer whose ghost also hovers over the book, F. Scott Fitzgerald. The title is stolen from Fitzgerald's novel, The Beautiful and the Damned. The Great Gatsby, the chapter of the first title, the title of the first chapter is also stolen from Scott Fitzgerald. And he talks about this tension between the individual and the universal, and how if you begin with a type character, you will find that you achieve nothing. But if you begin with a very specific individual and keep following it, you will arrive at a type. It will speak for something more than the larger character. And I think that was part of the whole method. I mean, he's just one person. People who critique me in India, that's often one of the lines that criticism takes. There are various lines of criticism. One is that I just made up things, which is astonishing because it's actually verifiable. The facts, the figures, the numbers. When I say something like the fact that, 40% of children under the age of 5 in India suffer from malnutrition. This is not something that I dreamt up on one of my, fantasies. This is something that is largely documented and verifiable. But all the other things that people will say is that you've just chosen a scamster to make this country look bad. But my argument, I suppose, is that he's very representative. If he's a scamster, he's very representative in that sense of this confidence trick. And the way that's what I think of the whole India Shining thing as really a kind of con game. It's like of, showing a little bits that are very, very flashy and very shiny to try and cover up other complex realities.
Right. I mean, I must confess that I myself had moments of recognition reading about Arindam Chaudhary. I mean, after all, Arindam Chaudhary, and that's the other thing that the discourse of corruption that seized India and Pakistan, in India with Anna Hazare and in Pakistan with Imran Khan, is that it makes you think that somehow you are not part of this. Well, you can't read about this seriously. If you're actually going to seriously read this, not have moments of recognition. Because we are all caught up in this. I mean, I was just talking with Siddhartha earlier about this. The fact of the matter is that, well, being many of us over here, most of us, I'm sure, Macaulay's children, right? We all know a little bit of our Shakespeare, the bard, we call him, right? In any event, this demon that inhabited the 16th century, called Shakespeare, right? He has this remarkable line, which all of us probably know, from Julius Caesar, right? I mean, the thing that strikes me about that line, if you compare it to today, 500 years later, dominated by an Anglo-Saxon world, right? Shakespeare says, Mark Antony says about Brutus, who has just killed Caesar, he says, yet Brutus says that Caesar was an ambitious man. Yet Brutus says he was ambitious. Now it's remarkable that the word ambition is a derogatory word, right? It's a term of abuse. In the 16th century, right, the term ambition is still a term of abuse, and it continues to be that for a while. But we cannot associate anything of the sort with that word today. It has completely transformed its meaning. And in Arindam Chaudhary, what you are showing us is this process of corruption of the word itself and what that has come to mean. What are the costs of ambition? The ambition that we all are, we are talking about our class now. There's a certain class inhabiting this space right now. We're speaking in English after all, right? So, what are the costs of this ambition, both psychically for us, each of us, Arindam Chaudhary's very hollow word, right? And on the other, more generally. So that's on the paradigm thing.
Well, I think, there's this whole idea, this very attractive idea of limitlessness, that, of expansion, of perpetual growth, India shining 8%, to next year 9%, the year after 10%, the year after who knows. As if there's something very natural and desirable about, growing. And I think what that leaves out is that it's almost a very physical kind of manifestation. There's something quite imperialist about that idea. You expand your borders, you expand your horizons, without taking into account that, we are individuals and we have these shades in our lives, nuances, emotions. In fact, that's one of the things that's not talked about in the New India very much. And I was very, very interested in that, in interviewing these elite characters. Do they feel sad? I mean, is that a normal question to ask? Not if you're doing a kind of regular profile. I mean, does Mukesh Ambani feel sad? I don't know if Mukesh Ambani feels sad. Does he feel melancholy when he's like on his, massive sort of, building? But I'm interested in those kind of questions because I guess I think of myself as primarily as a fiction writer. And I'm interested in the inner lives of people and what they have to do, how they echo and how they sometimes rub against what that outer world is. And the details are a part of that. And in that sense, the book, Noman talked about the details. Even though the book's really, I'm very proud of the reporting of the book. I'm very proud that it takes you to places that the standard Tom Friedman accounts of India don't take you, And in some sense, this book was a response to the world is flat kind of, the IT centers, the nice airports. Yes, you can get a good coffee in Bangalore airport, and yes, that's a very nice thing. But that in itself doesn't mean anything in terms of the larger India. Yes, the air conditioning is much better. That doesn't necessarily mean that India has improved vastly as a country. And, 20 years ago, it wasn't actually absurd to say things like that. But one of the massive changes that has happened in India at the top, at the elite levels, across the sort of the opinion classes to which I belong completely now, to which I have made my entry. I did not belong to it naturally, but I made my way into that. It's become absurd to raise these questions. They'll say, oh, you're a lefty, oh, you're a naysayer, oh, you're an you're a pessimist, oh, you're a Pakistani probably, So, but I'm interested in these questions because I think they are absolutely valid questions to ask of ourselves. Not like, it's not something I'm just going in and looking at as an anthropologist. And that's where, again, it differs from the classic sort of travel book going in. This book is very shaped by the person, the narrator, who's telling you the story. There's an I in the book. And that I has an history, that I has a memory, that I has biases, actually. When the I meets a guy, there are people I meet and I don't necessarily like, and I make that explicit in the book. Why I don't, because, I don't agree with that person's politics. So, essentially, I suppose the attempt was, while doing this incredibly detailed reporting, which really travels, I take you across many different parts of India. There are the management seminars in the five-star hotels. There's this great character, minor character, this cigar dealer, whom I'm really quite fond of, actually. Which is a very elite world, where Cohiba cigars are being sold in this sort of fancy little shopping enclave owned by the Indian Air Force. But it goes from there. It goes to a border town in Manipur, where I spent time in a brothel, basically, with these very young sex workers. And it's not just this question of creating contrasts, but the point is, there's this sort of very detailed reporting in the book, but ultimately I didn't want it to be a reporter's book. I wanted to read like a novel, and although entirely based on facts. And, so there are these limitations imposed by non-fiction, by the reporting, by the details. I can't really tell you what Arindam Chaudhary thinks. That's the thing. If I were a novelist and he was an imaginary character, I would go into his head. And I was very aware of the restriction when I was writing the book. I was thinking, oh, I wish he were an imaginary character. But no, that fidelity to truth demands. But I can tell you what I think in the book, because I do know my own thoughts. And I use that in some sense to create this sort of non-fiction novel almost as I think of it.
That's right. The next chapter, which is called Ghosts in the Machine, The Engineer's Burden. It's engineers and IT workers, people on the fast track to success.
Yes.
We get a sense of the hollowness of their inner world as well. And actually, while we're on this topic, one of the questions that I had in mind, one of the things that I find very intriguing about the book is the fact that you do get a sense of the inner world of these elite characters, right? So first in The Great Gatsby, Arindam Chaudhary, then in the engineer chapter that follows, again, the fellow who tries to write these nano poems on these microchips, very interesting characters, but the hollowness and the sense of frustration that people at the top level, right, inhabit, we get a sense of that inner world, and there are descriptions of that inner world, but as far as the subaltern characters, once you move down the class ladder, right, it's very interesting that there's rarely a description of the inner world. You see people going through all kinds of really horrible, terrible things, which of course we all know people go through all the time, poor people that is, except on this one page, one of the places that I identified where Siddhartha does talk briefly about the inner world of a subaltern or lower class character. A fellow who works in this steel factory, Pradeep, right? He had begun by working as a welder on ships in the port city of Surat in Gujarat, but he gave up that work after 6 months. He had been falling sick frequently, he said, suffering a great deal of pain in his back. Pradeep wouldn't elaborate on his ailments, even though I pressed him for details, wondering how he managed to do the hard labor of a tongsman if he suffered from back pain. Like most workers and like most members of India's underclass, he seemed to operate at a high level of abstraction. He seemed to operate at a high level of abstraction when it came to certain things, especially those that had to do with the body. Just as Dibya Jyoti had said that his mother died of fever, and Pradeep's young roommate had been afraid of the effects of dust, Pradeep would only say that he suffered from pain. In this case, obviously very excruciating pain, which is why he's always, when he's not doing what his task is, just played out on the bed, basically. In elite circles in India, this is a sign of the illiteracy of the lower classes, an indication of how they lack intellectual property as well as material property. But as I heard these simple words, fever, dust, pain, taking the place of any complicated diagnosis or description of symptoms, it struck me that one of the characteristics of being higher up on the class ladder was the specificity with which a person could speak of one's ailments. But there was another way of understanding the use of such simple words. The workers didn't have access to the kind of medical care that would let them receive complex formulations of their illness. So they suffered with a stoicism that was ingrained in their social status. Given the lives that migrant workers lived, someone like Pradeep had no choice but to abandon the nuances of illness for a broad catch-all word, pain. The same was true when it came to telling the story of his life, which was often empty of descriptive detail and rendered in thick strokes. So it's a remarkable fact about this book, I think, that in fact the inner world, when you do gesture to it, you're telling us that in fact, this is one of the constraints of nonfiction, is that you cannot, as it were, get inside for us. But really, even in gesturing, the book does a very good job of bringing to the fore, illuminating this inner world of these characters. But as you move down the class ladder, the inner world. So about this passage in particular, where you do zero in, I mean, after all, pain, something like pain, is something that is inner. But you give us a very different experience of that. Can you say something about it?
Sure. I mean, I think when you're interviewing workers, factory workers in this case, which was happening in Andhra Pradesh in the south, and where I spent a lot of time for this book, interviewing factory workers, but also on a different occasion spending a lot of time with farmers. Now, Andhra Pradesh is really interesting because the capital is Hyderabad. And Hyderabad is part of the India Shining, the boom economy. It's one of the wealthiest economies in the country. But around it is basically, I mean, this sort of factory land where I interviewed Pradeep, and then beyond that are these sort of farming regions falling into a kind of slow collapse, basically, where the farmers basically describe their lives as a kind of slow death. When you spend time with the farmers, they are very certain about one thing: they don't want their children to become farmers. Even though they are attached into the landscape, they are attached to the villages, they have lived in the villages for sometimes for 5 centuries, they can trace back, they are connected to the landscape, but they're very, very sure that this is a dead end, and the only thing to be done is to get your children out of this. There's no future. Of course, if the children were to get out of this, one of the futures they might have would be this factory. And the factory is it's a dramatic sort of landscape. It's just about 25 kilometers from the New Hyderabad airport. So if you fly into New Hyderabad airport, it's very, very shining. It's very, it's nicely laid out. There's a, coffee shop, and then you come across and it's like demarcated highways, and you take a kind of right turn towards Hyderabad. If you take a left turn, that's when you start coming across these small factories, which are very mysterious from the outside. It's very hard to tell what's being made inside them. Sometimes they don't really have signs. It's like you hear all sorts of mechanical noises. And that's one of the places in which I spent a lot of time in the factory. Now, one of the things you have to see is that when I was interviewing the rich, the question was, will the rich people And you can see it was problematic since Mr. Chaudhary sued me afterwards. Will they give me permission to talk to them? And in fact, this is a long-winded way of, answering your question. So when I first decided to approach Arindam Chaudhary, his publicity person met me and said, okay, we'll let you interview him, but we'll need to see all your notes before it goes to press. And I kind of had to think about it because I was very interested in the character by that time and so wanted to write about it. And I said, I can't accept that condition because I knew that if they saw my notes, they would want to change this, change that, change this, that. It's a very normal human response, And I said, I can't do that. Then they said, why should we allow you to interview him? Because I needed not one interview. I needed many, 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 many interviews, a lot of time. That's one of the things, I had to see him in different contexts. It's not just ek jagah ja ke, just sit in the office and have 1 hour won't do. I have to see you in different places. It is like letting me into their lives, which is hard. So anyway, they said, why should we trust you? And I said, you shouldn't trust me because I'm a writer and ultimately my fidelity is to the truth. They said, well, how do we decide then, whether we should let you interview, since you're not going to let us see the notes? And I said, you are business people. You are successful business people. And if you're thinking of letting me talk to Mr. Chaudhary, you're thinking that there's a possibility of great publicity for your company because this book will be published in other countries. And the danger is that, what I say may not be very good. So you are used to assessing risks. You decide what is greater for you, the desire for publicity or the need to protect. And you take a decision on that. And then they came back to me and said, no, go ahead and interview Tika. And I think Mr. Chaudhary was quite flattered actually to get a lot of time with me because he's quite an intelligent man and I think he's a bit bored by the sycophants around him all the time.
Oh, Cubans.
But when it comes to the factory workers, the question was, will their bosses give me permission to talk to the factory workers? Because the factory workers are owned by, in that sense, by somebody, they're migrant workers. And there the question was, I had to go to this factory where I was introduced to the managing director. And I said, I need full access to the workers. I don't want a guy from your office sitting with me when I'm talking to these workers, because then they won't. And so there are all these external conditions. The other thing that happens with the workers is that it's very hard to do the bourgeois thing of one-to-one. You can't really say, I would say, chalo, chai ke take me jaake, and Pradeep, I went and, I would go outside and, talk at the tea shack. But often the other workers would sit around. That concept of individuality wasn't there. And they would fill in. They would say, Pradeep has, Pradeep, it hurts because, he messed up in the assembly line yesterday. So it's a completely different idea in some sense of the self. That's what I feel.
Absolutely. There's one last question that I want to ask you. One thing that really struck me again about the book and how the book works is you already mentioned the word when you were talking about The Great Gatsby, ghosts, right? The second chapter is Ghosts in the Machine, the Engineer's Burden. Ghosts function in all kinds of other ways in this. In fact, it's a way in which the world can be tied together, these different worlds, right? Different worlds. So there's the manager at the factory. On the one hand, there's the production of steel. And then there is the worker who is being broken by the factory, right? Now, on page 201, here's this passage, right? When government officials, so this is the factory, the steel factory, where Siddhartha is talking to workers mostly, and then to some of the managers as well. So he says, when government officials showed up at the factory and discovered these violations, they did not enforce the rules. Instead, they took a cash bribe, got back into their vehicles, and drove back down the highway, so that the lack of a future for many of the workers was converted into the present enrichment of officials and factory owners, something we are quite familiar with, right? But listen to the sentence. It was the shadow transmutation. It was the shadow transmutation that ran in parallel to the alchemy of converting iron ore into TMT bars. Earlier on in this chapter, Siddhartha has described for us in this horrifying detail what the workers go through as this iron ore is converted into TMT bars, right? And here in this sentence, he said, it was the shadow transmutation that ran in parallel to the alchemy of converting iron ore into TMT bars, right? So how does this work? How did you come to think of ghosts and shadows that actually tie our world together?
Well, you have to, because it's like what is being shown, what is the visible process, doesn't, for me, explain the entirety of that world. I mean, I'll clarify for you. What does this factory do? It takes iron ore and it makes it into TMT bars, which TMT bars then are taken and then used in building condos and housing. And in fact, I actually went to one of the places where these TMT bars were being used to build these 1 crore villas. So one way of looking at it, the India Shining way of it, is saying that there is the iron ore, the material, and that's converted into the TMT bars, and then it becomes this sort of, beautiful special economic zone, SEZ kind of, housing development where rich people go and live. And not only that, if you talk about globalization, this factory uses a proprietary German technology for the production method. So this German company gets a royalty for per ton that's produced through this licensing of this technology. And that's what I think the standard business account would be. And I don't want to leave that out. But the other thing that's happening in this factory is basically there are 2,000 workers in the factory. And according to the law, if a worker works for a certain amount of time, that worker is entitled to pension, is entitled to ESI, okay, which is a cost that the owner does not want to enter into. So 70% of the workers are off the books. They don't exist. They are not on the record, because if they're not there, you just give them their monthly, and there's no ESI, there's no pension, and typically after 3 months, 4 months, you're tired, you leave, you're done for. So basically on paper, there are these, and of course the free market press rants about India's terrible labor laws that are constantly preventing this country from becoming, wonderful. It's like, chaining down the industrialist. So basically I thought about it, and it's basically there's this benefits that these workers are supposed to receive. Benefits that I receive as a middle class intellectual in my university in America. I would be very upset if they took away my whatever provident fund scheme. The workers don't get it. So a factory, then the government inspector shows up, and the government inspector takes a bribe. And the bribe is just very small, and I mean for a factory owner this is very reasonable. It's much more cost effective. Rather than give 200 rupees into 2,000 workers for their monthly ESI, why not give 1,000 rupees to the government inspector and send them away? And that's basically entering into the middle class. The corruption that Mr. Hazari doesn't talk about, or his supporters don't talk about. This is corruption, right? And I am sympathetic even to the government inspector, who's probably using that money, who probably doesn't get a good salary, who probably uses that money to send his kids to school. But, so there is this sort of shadow process. It's like the workers are giving up their future, their employment, their pension, that future is being converted into a different channel. And so there are all these shadow economies, these shadow processes that continue. And in some sense, I suppose if one were to tie things together, that's what I was interested in capturing, that underneath that new India, there are all these shadow Indias in parallel. And that's why I use the metaphor of ghosts and, ghosts and spirits. Literally so. I mean, it's basically, if these workers are not the books, they don't exist on the books. So even though they're using physical labor, to use very Marxist terms, converting the, iron ore into steel, they don't technically exist. They're not there. These people I interviewed to, Pradeep doesn't exist. Pradeep is a ghost. Pradeep will not be found. If I go back, this is the other thing between the elite classes and the underclasses. If I were to go back to, I could find Mr. Chaudhary. He wouldn't want to talk to me naturally. Or I could find the engineer. But Pradeep would be gone. He will not be at that factory.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Siddharth. I think the audience also has questions. Yes, Manisa.
Thank you very much, Siddhartha. I walked in a little bit late, so I don't know if you've already read from your book. I'd like to hear it in your own voice, even a passage if I may. But I just want to say that you've written such an important book, and I was struck by what you said about emotions. And you've written a book, a non-fiction book, but it is imbued with the emotions of fiction writing. And in the work that I do, where the people you're writing about are largely invisible, though we speak about working on poverty and alleviating poverty. I used your book very recently to make a point in Ethiopia around a large table where the poor could never appear, but where everything was being done for them. And it was in regard to microfinance, and I quoted from your book. And of course, whenever you speak in these terms, everybody looks at you and says, oh, there's the Marxist in the room. And oh, look, there's the Maoist and the Marxist and the socialist, and who let her into this? But then when I quoted from your book, and they all went and looked it up, the next day, the whole dialogue did change. And they took a very close look at what is microfinance and microcredit, and is it really, is it really what it's made out to be? So I want to thank you, because I think your book is very important and it should be read by Pakistanis, because what's happening in India is happening in Pakistan. It's happening in countries all over Africa in the name of rampant economic, it's not being called rampant, but it's economic growth. And really, what is this growth that's subsuming us as being human beings and our thinking and turning us all into ghosts? Thank you. So if you could read something, I would, if you haven't read, please, I would appreciate it.
Thank you, Vanessa. I mean, yes, I will be delighted to read a very quick section so that there's still time for other people to ask questions. I might as well read from the Ghost, the Factory chapter, actually. It's towards the end of the chapter where I'm sitting in a tea shack talking to Pradeep, and what happens is, as I'm talking to Pradeep, who's one of the characters featured, his foreman, his subcontractor, shows up and basically is extremely unhappy that I'm talking to Pradeep and wants me to, even though I've been given permission by his boss, by the managing director. So there's all these levels, and it's basically, there's a mild element of, coercion and threat in sort of, go away. I went back later, But basically, I'm sitting in this factory, outside the factory in this tea shack, and there's this new modern highway outside it. And I want to talk about just a man that I saw. For what happened to workers who fell through the hole, I didn't have a person I talked to, only a vision. It appeared the afternoon I was talking with Pradeep and Sarkar at the tea shack. It was the middle of the day, the sun blazing down on the steel factory. A man came walking down the middle of the road, although it wasn't a walk as much as a stumbling dance. As he came closer, the workers who had gathered outside the tea shack and at the factory gate began to stare. He was young, maybe in his late teens, dressed in a black t-shirt and trousers. His feet were bare, and he moved on those bare feet down the middle of the road, unheeding of any of us. His eyes were bloodshot, staring into the void. He was almost certainly drunk, but there was something about him that suggested a terrible violation. Everyone stared, no one moved, either because they were stunned by his appearance or because they were used to such figures. He went past us, drifting towards the new highway. Someone should stop him, I thought. He's going to get killed by a car. But I couldn't move and just stared on with the other men, as if he was our scapegoat, our sacrifice to unappeasable gods. A police jeep was parked near the edge of the highway, but the policemen made no move either, and the man was soon on the road, a barefooted figure plunging into the onrush of cars from Bangalore. I couldn't watch any longer and turned away. When I looked back again, I saw that he had just made it across and was still moving, a small but distinct figure headed towards the green fields pockmarked with black heaps of slag. Thank you.
Hi, my question's about censorship in India specifically, but broadly as well, because it's become an issue lately with the Jaipur Literary Festival, with the whole Salman Rushdie fiasco. And your book also faced a lot of censorship. Why is it that certain forms of censorship are get so much hype and so much defend in the literary world, but like certain forms of censorship, such as critique of this neoliberal economy and India shining, nobody really defends those kinds of censorships. It's not seen as an attack. It's not being labeled as a freedom of expression and all of those. So where do we go from here? Is there really such a stifling of critique for neoliberal India? Because like Arundhati Roy faces so much ire for this as well. Pankaj Mishra is another person who these people get so much hate, but then Salman Rushdie is this victimized person in the literary world. I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, I mean, I'm very, very glad to hear these names that you bring up. Arundhati and Pankaj are both writers I greatly admire, and they are great, and they are good friends too. And I think basically what has happened is partly there is this sort of model that the state is the most repressive agent. That is no longer true. The state is still a repressive agent. But now there are these other agents that are incredibly powerful, and corporations are a very big part of it. They're extremely powerful, they're extremely insidious. There are lots of other powerful sort of actors, and people don't want to talk about them because they impinge on one's livelihood in a very direct way. I mean, one of the things that's happened, especially in the English-speaking world in India, the writing world, English-speaking, is that we've become much closer to the sources of power, to the sources of corporate sponsorship, that basically they make enormous differences to how you're projected, whether you have a reputation or not, whether your books sell or not, whether you're actually even going to get a publishing deal. The government, by and large, is not going to lock away an English-speaking urban middle-class writers. I may be proved wrong, but they did lock away Arundhati for a short time. So there's censorship and there's censorship. I mean, nobody really talks about the fact that M.F. Hussain could not live in India. We will, which should be on par with the Salman Rushdie case if you're talking about intolerance and the sheer sort of intolerance that exists. But yeah, people don't want to talk about the corporate. The media is a big part of it as well. And the media, for which I worked in India for some years, has become incredibly corporatized. It believes absolutely, it is very close to the state in many ways. It is very close to all these neoliberal interests. And so, in a way, it becomes almost a distraction from these larger questions. I really don't know, from these larger questions of corporate censorship, the fact that, it's really not possible to write about poverty or Kashmir, or Chhattisgarh, what's happening with the Maoists, or the Northeast. I mean, I spent many years as a journalist in India failing to write about the Northeast where I'd grown up, in some kind of nuance. And that was not because of state pressure. It was completely internal to these to the corporate media and the elites who work within them, and from which largely much of the writing classes come from that.
Sorry, you want to wrap up? Well, thank you very much, Siddharth, and thank you very much, all of you, for coming.
Thank you very much.
If you all want to get your books signed, you can just go outside, and please remain seated and let the panel step out first. Thank you.